Hello everyone, Caroline here. In today's video I want to share 5 cards that I created with the Papercraft Society Box from the month of May 2020. So let's get started with card number 1. For card number 1 I chose a white card base. It's A2 size. And I also have here 2 pieces of Bristol paper. So for my sentiment, I went with the birthday wishes from the stamp set. And I just stamped them out on that Bristol paper scrap. And for that I used vintage photo. And I'm using the archival ink here. Then I'm using this other piece of Bristol paper, which is a little bit thinner, or not thinner, but in width smaller than A2. And I'm just playing around with the 3 inks that came in the kit. I started with the pink one, and then I'm adding the yellow, because this will mix nicely to an orangey color. And then when I have that layer done, I'm adding some green to the edges, and I'm be careful not to smudge it too much, because I want this still be green and not brownish. Then I'm adding a little bit more pink to the mix, another layer, and also when that is dried I'm adding another layer of green on top. When this is all dry, I used my heat tool for that. I am using the big background stamp that came in one of the sets. And I'm using the pink ink to add some texture to my background. And I'm making sure that I don't have a straight edge. So I'm taking a little bit of the ink away on the side. And then I'm adding also some green, using the same background stamp, and add this to the bottom. Now that green was a little bit weaker, so I'm using one of the other grungy stamps and adding some extra texture with green. And I'm using also the background stamp again. I also pulled out this little splatter stamp and adding also some splatters to the side, to the edge. Then I'm using the lace stamp that came in the kit, and I'm using the archival ink in vintage photo, and I'm adding that to one of the sides. Then I'm using the die that the edge die that came with the die set, and I'm cutting an edge on the right and on the left side to that background piece, and then keeping that one piece that I cut off. Then I'm using this little lacy die, and I'm adding this to my white background piece, and adding this just as a cutout. And then I'm using this leftover piece that I have cut off, and I'm gluing that to that one side. Then I'm using this embossing paste, and I'm using the stencil that came with the kit, and I'm just very carefully, this is very liquidy, this paste, It's almost like an acrylic paint. And I'm adding a butterfly on the bottom. Just a little cut off, and the same I'm doing it on the top, and I have the cut off on the left side here of the butterfly. So I'm not using the whole butterfly, just a slightly cut off. So when this is dry, it's very funny. It almost feels like really like embossing powder heated up, but the texture feels like that. It's not like a texture paste. It's very interesting. Now I'm adding to the back of that white background piece a strip of that pink cardstock that came with the kit. And I'm cutting the leftovers. And then I'm adding a foam tape to my background piece. And I'm gluing this white piece on top of my white card base. And then I'm adding this background piece on top, so it gives it a little bit more dimension with the foam tape. And then I'm using the 3 inks, and I'm just distress the edge of this sentiment with all 3 colors. And I'm adding foam tape to that. And I'm placing this in the center a little bit in a little angle to my card. And as a final embellishment, I'm using pink glitter drops and add them to the side of the butterflies. And here is the finished card. Card number 2. So for this card I'm using again a white card base, and I'm using another piece of Bristol paper, and I also cut out 2 of those little graphic elements with my die cut machine. So for this background I'm just rubbing the ink in stripes horizontally on that piece of Bristol paper. Started with the pink, then I'm adding a yellow, and then I'm adding my green. And I'm doing that until I'm satisfied with the result. Then I'm adding some water drops to get this distress looking effect. And when this is dried, I'm using my brush here, and I'm mixing up some green with pink to give it a more muddy color, and I'm using the little stencil that came in the kit and add some texture. And I'm using all 3 colors, some green, and then when I'm happy with the result, I'm pulling out one of the bigger stamps and 2 smaller stamps and that pocket watch. So I'm using this time the VersaFine Clair in black, and add those stamps to my background, and I'm centered the pocket watch right in the middle, and then I'm using this stamp that looks like a stitched line, and I'm add this to the top and to the bottom, and I'm doing secondary stamps on the sides, and then I'm using this triangle distressed stamp and adding that to my background as well. And then I'm using just the same background stamp again. I'm adding a little bit more texture. Now for this card I decided to go and use some Nouveau embellishing mousse in gold. This is Indian gold, and I'm using the stencil that has the splatters, and I'm adding some splatters on the edges, in the corners. The reason why I didn't use the white here is I wanted to be a little bit more settled. I didn't want the white to contrast too much. That's why I went with the gold. And then I'm using the gold as well and add this to my stitched stamp here and adding also some gold to the edge. Then I'm using just a scrap piece of white cardstock and stamp out my sentiment. Time flies, and I cut this to size, and then again I'm distressing the edge of my sentiments with all three colors. And then I'm adding those two little elements, graphic elements that I had cut out earlier, and I add this to the top and to the bottom of my sentiment to give it a little frame. And then I'm adding some foam tape, and I also decided to distress the edge of my background piece here. So I'm using the espresso and the black soot archival ink. Then I also added some white splatters, and this will be just very gentle white splatters, and they will dry, not completely white, they will sink a little bit into the paper just for some extra texture. Then I'm attaching my background with liquid glue to my card base here, and I am adding my sentiment right on top of the pocket watch, right in the middle there. And I'm adding some white Nouveau drops now, just a few, and some stickles. And here's my finished card. Okay, card number 3. So this card gonna be a 5x7 card, and I cut out I cut a piece of this pink paper cardstock, and I'm choosing some elements here. I used 2 dies from my stash, the hard dies, and I also used a piece of Bristol paper, and I cut out the bigger heart into my pink cardstock, and then I'm laying making a little mask here, and I'm laying the heart on top of my Bristol paper, and I'm just sketching in a bigger heart. So I'm going to create kind of a shadow effect, and I will lay this white piece on top of the pink one. Now I'm roughing up the edge here, and I actually like that this cardstock has a white core, so it has this, you can see this white edge looking out. And then I'm using one of the stencil. This is the one that looks like a grungy circle, and I am adding this now to my white Bristol piece that's gonna be the top. And I'm randomly adding this stencil to this piece, and then I'm using some water and actually stamp the stencil also on top for kind of grungy effect. Then I'm adding the yellow in the same manner, and I just randomly placing this, turning the stencil to get kind of a grungy pattern. And I do the same with the green ink. And then I'm drying this a little bit, and I'm adding also a little bit of splatters where I think it needs more color. Then I'm just mixing up those inks that I had left over on my glass mat, and I'm using them to distress the edge of this piece. Now you can see how I put this on top, and I roughed up the edges of the heart that's inside. Then I used a piece of that pattern paper that came with the kit, and I decided to add a little bit more texture to that piece. So I'm using this background stamp and just white pigment ink, and I'll also add this little stencil again with some pink color. And I'm also adding some white splatters on that piece. Then I'm using my piece here and add some brown, this is like pine cone, feather ink, and I'm adding my sentiment to that piece. And I also thought that I need to darken up the edge on this, and added some extra brown vintage photo to my piece. Now I'm stamping out this key, and I'm used this craft paper that came with the kit. And I stamped the key in black, and I also embossed that with clear, so I didn't have this on tape here, but I'm added some clear embossing powder over the black ink. Then I also cut out a little piece, a little heart, with some vellum paper from my stash. And here I'm assembling my card. I'm adding some liquid glue to my key, and added also kind of a paper ribbon and some satin ribbon to my key. And here you can see how this has a little shadow effect. I'm adding some 3D glue to that vellum paper here, and I'm setting this right into the center. And I'm just cutting off the ribbon. I still leave a little bit left over. I want this ribbon to go over the card a little bit. And then I'm adding some Nuvo drops. And I have those cork hearts with the gold glitter in them. And I thought these hearts would work perfectly with this card. So I took 3 different sizes, and I'm adding them to my card. And here you can see I used a bunch of Nuvo drops for final embellishment, and this is the finished card. Card 4. So this card is again an A2 card, and here I cut out a piece of that pattern paper and also a piece of this yellow pattern paper, and I used the one on the top and the bottom that has this little lace print on it. And I'm using this scallop edge die and cut some edges here. I cut it and I cut out one piece with the lace, and I'm distressing the edge of all pieces here to give it a little bit more dimension. And then I'm adding this pattern paper to my white card base, and I'm adding this piece, this smaller piece to the top underneath, and give it some dimension here. And then I am cut away the leftovers, and I'm adding this other piece on the bottom, and I'm using just some liquid glue and use only the bottom edge. So the top will be a little bit loose and it has a little bit more dimension, 3D effect. Then I'm just securing it with a little bit more of liquid glue. And I am using a sentiment that I have from the sentiment sheet that came with the kit, and I'm just framing this on a piece of this pink cardstock, and then I'm cutting this to size. And then I'm using some vellum paper, and I'm using the butterfly stamp, and I will stamp this out with all three. I'm just mixing up the inks on a butterfly, and I'm stamping this out of the vellum paper, and I do this 3 times, and then I am actually using my clear embossing powder and just emboss in clear on top of the ink. Then I'm using the die that came with the kit that matches this butterfly, and I'm cut them out. And then I'm assembling here my sentiment. I'm adding this beautiful on the bottom and an angle. I let it stick out a little bit behind that lace. And I'm adding this other part of the sentiment on top. And then I'm arranging my butterflies, and I'm just gluing them in the middle. So the wings gonna stand up. And then for final touch, I'm using again my pink glitter drops and also some stickles. And this is the unicorn color. And I'm also adding the stickles inside the lace for extra sparkle. And here is my finished card. Card 5. So my last card, I decided to go with a green yellow color, and I cut out this little dragonfly with a piece of green mirror cardstock from my stash, and I created here another piece, a smooshed piece, where I used already yellow and green. And I actually let it dry so I can add another layer now. I'm mixing up this green to make it a little darker and add a little bit more texture to my piece here. And then I'm using a piece that I cut out from the green cardstock, and I rough up the edge, and I'm adding this as a background layer to my card. And here I'm used kind of a cream card base, And then I'm using my piece here, and when that is dry, I'm also distressing the edge. I'm using this green. And then I'm ripping up a piece, 2 pieces actually, of the green pattern paper. And I'm ripping this to size, and I'm adding this one on the left. And I use one on the right, just for extra texture. Then I'm using my piece here, and I'm adding more texture with the background stamp, and I'm using the green ink to give it a more grungy effect. And then I'm using again more, distress the edge a little bit more, a little bit darker, and I rough up the edge. And then I'm using my pine cone VersaFine, clear VersaFine, and I'm adding this as a contrast to the side. And to the top and the bottom. Then I'm cutting out a circle out of vellum paper, and also I used one piece that I use, and I'm stamping out my sentiment. And then I'm using that vellum circle, and I'm mixing a little bit of the green ink with this embossing paste on my glass mat here. And this will give the colored embossing paste not completely white. It has kind of a pastel-y yellow greenish color, and I'm adding this to my vellum circle. Then while this is drying, I'm actually ripping up a piece of pattern paper and a piece of vellum, and then I'm using my heat tool, and I actually heat up that embossing paste. Now you have to be careful with this because it's gonna bubble up, but in this case I really like the bubble effect. It has almost like a cracking look. And then I'm adding this vellum piece on top of a other circle that I cut out with the pattern paper. And then assembling my card here, I'm adding this piece and my sentiment, and I'm just adding a little staple there. I'm adding some foam tape to attach my sentiment, and I also add some foam tape to my circle here. Add this on top, and then I'm using my little my liquid glue and attaching this little dragonfly right on top of that circle. And for final embellishment, I'm using my green Nuvo drops here and adding just a few drops diagonally on top and on the bottom of that circle, and also some gold stickles for some sparkle. And here is the finished card. So, and here are all the cards again in close up. I had so much fun playing around with this kit. I really love the stamps. I'm loving the dies. And for somebody who likes mixed media or wants to get into mixed media, I think this is the perfect box to get started. It has everything you need to get some cool backgrounds going. So I hope I gave you a little bit inspiration, what you can do. And I hope you liked my video, and of course I hope to see you in my next video. Until then, bye.